Ava Sinclair never set out to start a war, but some battles had a way of finding you whether you were ready or not. It began with a simple refusal: one seat, one flight, one moment where she chose not to move. But that choice set off a chain reaction she never could have anticipated. What started as a confrontation with an entitled woman named Karen Whitmore on an airplane soon spiraled into something far more dangerous: a web of corporate corruption, buried secrets, and powerful enemies who would do anything to keep their sins hidden. But Ava wasn't the type to back down. As the stakes rose and the battlefields shifted from airports to boardrooms, from whispered threats to open confrontations, she realized she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced before her. And by the time it was over, Ava wasn't just exposing the truth. She was rewriting the rules of the game itself. Ava Sinclair had no reason to believe this flight would be any different from the countless others she had taken in her career. It was supposed to be a simple business trip: board the plane, settle into her seat, review her presentation one last time, land in Chicago, and secure the Lockwood International contract, a career-defining opportunity that had taken months to cultivate. But the universe, as always, had other plans. As she stepped onto the aircraft, a sleek Boeing 787, she took in the familiar hum of the engines, the crisp scent of recirculated air, the quiet shuffle of passengers stowing away their belongings, an environment she had come to know like the back of her hand. She navigated her way to seat 12C, a coveted aisle seat with extra legroom, the result of her meticulous planning. It wasn't a matter of preference, but necessity. Her left knee, a relic from her track and field days in college, had never quite recovered from the injury that ended her athletic career. The added space allowed her to stretch without discomfort, a small but crucial detail in ensuring she arrived in Chicago focused and ready to dominate the boardroom. She slid her leather tote under the seat in front of her, powered on her laptop, and began skimming through the final points of her strategy proposal. This was how she liked to travel: efficient, uninterrupted, and invisible to the world around her. But then, like a storm brewing on the distant horizon, entitlement arrived in designer sunglasses and a tailored white blazer. "Excuse me," came a voice, sharp and clipped, slicing through the relative hush of the cabin like a blade through silk. Ava didn't look up at first, assuming it was directed at someone else. "Excuse me," the voice repeated, this time with an unmistakable edge of impatience. Ava lifted her gaze and found herself staring at a blonde woman in her mid-40s, standing in the aisle with one hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a young girl, no older than 8, who clutched the straps of a pink backpack like it was a lifeline. The woman's lips were painted in the kind of red that screamed money and arrogance, and the sunglasses perched atop her head seemed comically unnecessary indoors. Ava had encountered her kind before: women who mistook privilege for power, who carried themselves like the world owed them deference simply for existing. "Yes," Ava replied, her tone polite but firm, already sensing where this was going. "My daughter needs to sit by the window," the woman declared, her free hand gesturing toward seat 12A, the window seat occupied by someone else entirely. "You'll need to move." Ava blinked, momentarily thrown by the sheer audacity of the statement. She had expected a request, not a command. There was no "would you mind?" or "would it be possible?" Zranya, just the expectation that she would comply without question. Ava let the silence stretch between them, deliberately giving the woman a chance to realize her mistake, but entitlement rarely recognized its own reflection. "I'm sorry," Ava said, her voice calm despite the irritation curling at the edges of her patience. "But this is my assigned seat." The woman's expression tightened, her gaze flicking over Ava's business suit, the neatness of her braids, the open laptop on her tray table. A look Ava had encountered before, one that assessed and dismissed in the same breath. A look that said, "You don't belong here, do you?" My daughter gets anxious on flights, the woman pressed, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was still loud enough for several passengers nearby to hear. She needs the window. Surely you can understand that. Ava understood a lot of things. She understood what it was like to have doors closed in her face without explanation. She understood the weight of being one of the few black women in every executive room she entered, carrying not just her own ambitions, but the unspoken responsibility of proving she belonged there. And she understood with crystal clarity what was happening right now. Ma'am, Ava said, not unkindly but immovably, my seat assignment is 12C. Your daughter's seat is wherever you've been assigned. I'm not moving. The woman's face flushed a deep, mottled red, her fingers tightening on her daughter's shoulder. The girl, to her credit, looked painfully embarrassed, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she wished she could sink right through it. Ava almost felt bad for her. Almost. I need to speak to a flight attendant, the woman snapped, as if summoning the powers that be to correct this blatant injustice. Be my guest, Ava said, already turning back to her laptop. She felt the tension around her shift, the subtle shift in passenger dynamics, some curious, some judgmental, some silently rooting for her. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed an older black man across the aisle watching the interaction. When their eyes met, he gave her a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement from someone who recognized the moment for what it was. The click-clack of heels approached as the woman stormed down the aisle, and minutes later she returned with a flight attendant in tow. Gabriel Torres, according to his name tag, was in his mid-30s, with the polished ease of someone who had seen every kind of passenger dispute imaginable. His smile was professional, but his eyes were already wary. He had likely been fed a very different version of this story before he arrived. Hi there, he said smoothly. Is there a problem? Before Ava could speak, the woman launched into a well-rehearsed tirade. Yes, my daughter needs the window seat for her anxiety, and this woman refuses to move. She tilted her chin up, the picture of righteous indignation. We're in row 12, seats A and B. Gabriel pulled out his tablet and tapped a few times, his expression unreadable as he scanned the seating chart. Ma'am, what's your name? He asked. Karen Whitmore, the woman announced, chin still tilted defiantly. Ava bit the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. Of course her name was Karen. Gabriel continued scanning his screen, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he reached the seating assignment. Miss Whitmore, I see that you and your daughter are actually assigned to row 22, seats A and B. Karen's face stiffened, but she recovered quickly. Yes, but those seats don't recline properly, and my daughter needs the window for her anxiety. Surely you can rearrange things for a child. Gabriel turned to Ava. And you are? Ava Sinclair, seat 12C. She handed over her boarding pass, proof undeniable. The flight attendant nodded, looking at his tablet again before turning back to Karen. Miss Whitmore, he said, his tone polite but firm. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and your daughter to return to your assigned seats. Karen's mouth fell open. Excuse me? Miss Sinclair has paid for and been assigned this seat, Gabriel continued. She is not obligated to move. The cabin had grown quieter. That distinct hush that falls when people sense conflict brewing. Karen's eyes flashed. We'll remember this experience when choosing airlines in the future. She spun on her heel and stormed toward the back, her daughter trailing behind her, head down in shame. As Gabriel turned to Ava, he slipped something into her lap, a small, folded piece of paper. Then, without another word, he walked away. Ava unfolded the note. Be careful. She's not just an entitled passenger. She's someone powerful. Ava Sinclair sat motionless for a moment, the small slip of paper, burning between her fingers as if it carried the weight of something far heavier than a hastily scribbled warning. Be careful. She's not just an entitled passenger, she's someone powerful. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable wrapping tighter around her chest like an unseen cord, pulling at the edges of her intuition, whispering that something about this encounter, this woman, wasn't just an unfortunate brush with a privileged stranger, but rather the beginning of something far more insidious. She tucked the note into the pocket of her blazer, casting a glance down the aisle where Karen Whitmore had retreated, her perfectly tailored white blazer now just a blur among the shifting bodies of passengers settling into their seats. The woman exuded an air of self-importance, the kind of person who was used to getting what she wanted and had no patience for anything, or anyone, who stood in her way. But Gabriel Torres' warning suggested this wasn't just about arrogance. No, it was something else. Something deeper. Ava turned her gaze toward the older man across the aisle, the one who had given her that small, knowing nod earlier. But he had already returned to reading his newspaper, his expression unreadable. The engines rumbled to life beneath them, a deep, thrumming vibration that reverberated through the cabin, signaling the inevitable. The flight was about to take off, and whatever this was, whatever storm had just started brewing, she had no choice now but to ride it out until they landed in Chicago. She took a slow, measured breath, shaking off the lingering unease, and forced herself to focus on what mattered. Her meeting with Lockwood International, one of the most prestigious financial firms in the country. It was a company with an untarnished reputation, the kind of place where power was built in boardrooms and cemented by silent handshakes behind closed doors. If she secured this deal, it wouldn't just be a career milestone. It would be the career milestone, the one that would launch her from consultant to corporate legend. She had spent months crafting her proposal, anticipating every possible objection, refining every counterpoint, ensuring that the strategy she presented tomorrow would be flawless. And yet, despite all her meticulous preparation, she couldn't shake the feeling that her biggest obstacle wasn't going to come from inside the Lockwood boardroom, but rather from a woman who had just tried to steal her airplane seat. As the plane lifted off the ground, Ava pressed her head back against the seat, staring blankly at the glow of the seatbelt sign, trying to will away the growing tension in her chest. It was ridiculous. Karen Whitmore was just another entitled socialite, another rich woman who had likely never been told no in her life, another spoiled executive who thought that bending the world to her will was simply how things worked. And yet, that note, Gabriel's expression, the unmistakable shift in his demeanor when Karen had whispered something to him just before he checked the seating chart. Like a warning had passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of something much larger than what it seemed on the surface. Ava clenched her jaw, determined to push it aside, at least for now. She pulled out her laptop, willing herself to focus, flipping through her slide deck one last time, scanning the numbers she knew by heart, the intricate layers of corporate restructuring models, strategic cost-cutting initiatives, and diversity implementation frameworks that she had spent the better part of a year developing. But the moment her eyes flicked over the Lockwood Executive Leadership Team slide, something in her brain snapped into focus like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Her breath hitched. Karen Whitmore. The name wasn't there, but the realization struck her like a gut punch. The CEO of Lockwood International was Edward Whitmore, a last name that wasn't exactly rare, but combined with the wealth, the arrogance, the polished veneer of someone who had never faced real consequences. The connection was undeniable. Could Karen Whitmore be related to him? A wife? A sister? A cousin? It was too much of a coincidence. Ava quickly pulled up a browser, her fingers moving with urgency as she typed the name into a search engine, her heartbeat accelerating as the results loaded. And there it was. Karen Whitmore, Senior Vice President of Corporate Ethics and Compliance at Lockwood International. Ava's stomach dropped. It wasn't just a coincidence. Karen Whitmore wasn't just some entitled woman throwing a tantrum about airplane seating. She was a gatekeeper. a powerful, deeply embedded executive at the very company Ava was about to step into. And Ava had just made an enemy out of her before even setting foot in their headquarters. A cold realization slithered down her spine. That wasn't just a petty power move, that was a test, and Ava had failed. She exhaled slowly, schooling her expression into calm. Neutrality, despite the way her mind was already racing, recalculating, rearranging strategies, flipping through potential damage control solutions. But no matter which way she turned it, the facts remained the same. She had just publicly humiliated a woman who held real power at Lockwood. Someone who, with a few carefully placed words, could torpedo Ava's chances before she even stepped into the meeting. Ava had planned for everything. Every possible hurdle, every potential pushback, every corporate obstacle that could be thrown her way. But she hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned for a personal vendetta. And if there was one thing she knew about women like Karen Whitmore, it was that they didn't forgive and they sure as hell didn't forget. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, the minutes bleeding into each other as Ava stared blankly at her screen. No longer seeing the carefully prepared slides in front of her, her mind too tangled in the web of Karen's unexpected presence in her professional battlefield. She barely noticed the landing, the mechanical voice of the captain announcing their arrival, the slow shuffle of passengers collecting their belongings. But as she stepped off the plane, rolling her carry-on behind her, a sinking sensation settled deep in her stomach. Something was waiting for her in Chicago, and it had nothing to do with her presentation. Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her chest tightening, as an unknown number flashed across the screen. Against her better judgment, she answered. A long, heavy silence stretched across the line before a familiar voice finally spoke. Ms. Sinclair? Karen Whitmore's voice was smooth, deliberate, dripping with the kind of self-satisfied amusement that sent a chill straight through Ava's spine. I trust you had a comfortable flight. Ava's grip on the phone tightened. Cut to the chase, Karen. A low, knowing chuckle. Oh, I will. You see, we're meeting tomorrow, but I thought I'd save you the trouble of any unnecessary hope. You're wasting your time, sweetheart. There is no contract. Ava's pulse spiked. Excuse me? You heard me. A pause. Then a deadly whisper. You should have moved seats when you had the chance. The line went dead. Ava stood frozen in the middle of O'Hare International Airport, surrounded by the hum of oblivious travelers, the distant murmur of boarding announcements, the echo of rolling suitcases against polished floors. And yet she had never felt so acutely alone. Because now she knew this wasn't just a contract negotiation. This was a war. Ava Sinclair had always prided herself on being unshakable. A woman whose resolve had been forged in the fires of corporate battles and relentless ambition. But as she stood in the arrivals hall of O'Hare International Airport, the chilling finality of Karen Whitmore's words still rattled in her chest like an aftershock. There is no contract. The statement rang in her ears, sharp and deliberate, designed to gut her chances before she even set foot in Lockwood's pristine boardroom. And yet, Ava knew Karen was lying, because if the deal had truly been off the table, if Lockwood had already decided to move on, Karen wouldn't have bothered to make that call. No, this wasn't just a power move. It was a warning, a declaration of war. Ava inhaled slowly, forcing the tension from her body as she rolled her carry-on toward the curb, hailing a black sedan from her rideshare app. The city loomed ahead, the glassed and steel skyline of Chicago glittering like a fortress of untouchable power. The kind of place where kings were made and careers were crushed beneath the weight of the unspoken rules that governed boardrooms like Lockwood's. If Karen had wanted to rattle her, to break her resolve before the battle even began, she had badly underestimated who she was dealing with. Ava had spent years fighting to carve a space for herself in an industry that wasn't built for her success, outmaneuvering men who dismissed her, navigating power structures that sought to keep her as nothing more than a footnote in their corporate narratives, and she hadn't come this far to let a petty, entitled executive with a bruised ego stand in her way. She stared out the car window as the skyline blurred past, her mind already working 3 steps ahead, recalculating strategies, planning contingencies. Karen had power, yes, but she also had a weakness. Her need for control, her arrogance, her belief that she had already won. That meant she would be watching Ava closely, expecting her to falter, to react, to panic. Ava wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, she was going to walk into Lockwood International tomorrow morning as if she hadn't just received a direct threat, as if the contract was already hers, as if she owned the goddamn room. Because if there was one thing Ava knew about the corporate world, it was that confidence was a currency just as powerful as money or influence. It dictated the way people perceived you, the way they responded, the way they decided whether you were a threat or just another ambitious consultant doomed to be discarded. The trick was never letting them see you bleed. As the car pulled up in front of the Sterling, an upscale boutique hotel with an entrance that gleamed under the city lights, Ava stepped out with practiced ease, slipping the driver a tip before making her way inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, the kind of place where executives conducting billion-dollar mergers could sip overpriced scotch in dimly lit corners, sealing their deals with whispers and handshakes. She checked in swiftly, taking the elevator up to her suite on the 23rd floor, but before she even set her bags down, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Her pulse kicked up. It could be Karen again, twisting the knife, pressing her advantage, or it could be something worse. She exhaled and answered. "I hope I'm not interrupting," came a deep, smooth voice, one that Ava didn't recognize immediately, but that carried an unmistakable edge of intrigue, of someone who knew far more than they were letting on. "Who is this?" she asked, already reaching for her laptop, her instincts flaring to life like a soldier snapping to attention. "Elijah Carter," the voice said, and suddenly it clicked. The journalist from the plane, the man who had slipped her a business card with a single cryptic sentence. She does this all the time, but this time, it might be bigger than you think. Ava straightened, gripping the phone tighter. "I take it this isn't a social call." A low chuckle. "No, Miss Sinclair. I don't waste time on small talk when there's something worth chasing." A pause then, and trust me, this is worth chasing. Ava's stomach nodded with equal parts curiosity and caution. She had spent enough time around reporters to know that they were rarely interested in corporate squabbles over consulting contracts. If Elijah Carter was involved, it meant there was something bigger at play, something beneath the surface of her encounter with Karen, something worth exposing. And that meant she needed to know exactly what game she had just walked into. "I'm listening," she said carefully, lowering herself onto the edge of the hotel's pristine white couch, her gaze flicking to the Chicago skyline sprawling outside her window, as if the city itself held the answers. There was a beat of silence on the other end, the kind that stretched long enough to suggest that Elijah was weighing just how much to tell her. Then, finally, "Karen Whitmore isn't just an executive at Lockwood," he said, his voice quieter now, like a man revealing a secret that carried real consequences. "She's the gatekeeper to something much, much bigger. And you just became a problem." Ava's blood went cold, but she didn't flinch. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, of keeping her emotions locked behind steel doors, of never allowing anyone the satisfaction of seeing her vulnerable. "Elaborate." "You're here for the Lockwood deal, right?" Elijah asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "The consulting contract that's supposed to redefine their corporate infrastructure?" "Yes." A slow exhale from Elijah's end. "That contract, it's just a smokescreen, a distraction." Ava's mind raced, but she forced herself to stay anchored in logic, in strategy. "A distraction from what?" There was a longer pause this time, and when Elijah finally spoke, His voice had lost its earlier playfulness. From a massive corporate cover-up, Lockwood isn't just restructuring, they're burying something. And Karen, she's the one holding the shovel. Ava's entire body went still. She had expected politics. She had expected resistance. She had even expected Karen to try and sabotage her chances, to protect her territory, to play dirty. But this was something else entirely. Elijah, she said slowly, carefully choosing her words like weapons, knowing that whatever she said next would define the next step in this game. If what you're saying is true, then why are you telling me? What do you want? Another low chuckle, this one sharper. Because, Miss Sinclair, whether you realize it or not, you're already part of this. And I think you're the only one who might be able to blow it all wide open. Ava exhaled, staring out at the city, at the towering monuments of power and corruption, and she felt it deep in her bones. This wasn't just about a contract anymore. This was about survival. And the war had only just begun. Ava Sinclair had always known that power wasn't just about who held the title or who had the biggest office. It was about who controlled the narrative, who decided which stories were told and which ones were buried beneath polished corporate statements and carefully curated press releases. And right now, she was standing on the precipice of a story so much bigger than she had ever imagined, one that had nothing to do with consulting contracts or corporate restructuring, but something darker, deeper, and far more dangerous. As she sat in the dim glow of her hotel room, staring at the illuminated skyline of Chicago's corporate empire, Elijah Carter's words still echoed in her head, ringing with an ominous certainty that sent a slow, deliberate pulse of adrenaline through her veins. Karen Whitmore isn't just protecting her position, she's protecting a secret. And Lockwood isn't restructuring. They're burying something. The weight of it settled on her, the implications unraveling in real time as she pieced together every strange moment from the past 24 hours. The entitled arrogance of Karen on the plane, the note from Gabriel Torres warning her to be careful, the phone call meant to rattle her confidence before she even had a chance to step foot in Lockwood's headquarters. But now, it wasn't just about sabotage. It was about something much bigger than her career. Something so big that a journalist was already circling it, looking for an opening, a crack in the pristine facade of Lockwood International. And she had just stumbled right into the center of it. Ava's fingers hovered over her laptop keyboard, the bright white screen reflecting back at her as she considered her next move. She had two choices. She could walk away, book the next flight out of Chicago, wash her hands of whatever corporate scandal was festering beneath the surface, and let someone else dig into it. Or she could play the game, step into the fire, and find out exactly what Karen was trying to hide. And really, there was never any question. She took a slow breath and started digging. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up every public document she could find on Lockwood International's financials, compliance reports, regulatory filings, anything that could give her insight into what Elijah had been hinting at. On the surface, everything looked clean, just as expected from a powerhouse firm like Lockwood. Impeccable financials, strong quarterly earnings, a reputation built on stability and trust. But the deeper she went, the more she started noticing inconsistencies. Tiny details, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for them. A sudden, unexplained leadership change 6 months ago, with two high-ranking executives leaving quietly under the guise of personal reasons. A string of settlements in arbitration courts, sealed from public record, but large enough that they hinted at something far more serious than simple HR disputes. And then there was a quiet but strategic shift in Lockwood's investments, one that showed them divesting from certain markets just months before those industries suffered financial setbacks, as if they had known what was coming before the rest of the world did. Inside Ava's mind, the puzzle was forming, the edges sharpening into something terrifyingly clear. Lockwood wasn't just restructuring, they were covering their tracks. Her heart pounded as she clicked on a particular document, an internal compliance audit from 3 years ago, one that should have been routine, buried among hundreds of others in the archives of the Securities and Exchange Commission's records. But this one stood out, not because of what it said, but because of what had been redacted. Large sections of the document were blacked out, entire paragraphs wiped away, replaced with vague legal jargon about ongoing internal reviews and proprietary corporate matters. Ava had seen enough of these kinds of documents before to know what this meant. Lockwood had been under investigation. The problem was, for what? She was about to dig deeper when a notification flashed across her screen. Incoming email, Gabriel Torres? Ava's stomach clenched. The flight attendant, the man who had slipped her the warning note before she had even known she was walking into a war. With a quick breath, she opened it. Subject: I wasn't supposed to tell you this. Ms. Sinclair, I don't know what you're walking into, but I know it isn't what you think. Karen Whitmore, she doesn't just destroy careers, she buries people. You need to be careful. If you want to know what's really happening, meet me at Belmont Coffee House. Midnight. Don't tell anyone, and don't be followed. Ava's breath hitched. She read it again. She buries people. It wasn't just a figure of speech. A slow chill curled through her spine as she stared at the words on the screen, the weight of them pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. There was something so much bigger happening here, something she was only beginning to grasp. And if she walked into Lockwood tomorrow unprepared, she wouldn't just be walking into a hostile boardroom, she'd be walking into a trap. Her mind raced. Midnight. Belmont Coffee House. It was risky. Too risky. Karen already had her in her sights. If she was watching Ava this closely, then she probably already had people in place, tracking her movements, making sure she did not dig too deep. But that's exactly why she needed to go. Because if Karen was trying this hard to keep something buried, then whatever it was worth uncovering. Ava shut her laptop, grabbed her coat, and checked the time. 11:27 p.m. She had 33 minutes to decide whether she was ready to step all the way into the fire. But really, she already knew the answer. She pulled up her rideshare app, requested a car to Belmont Coffee House, and stepped into the cool Chicago night, her mind already calculating escape routes, contingency plans, backup strategies. Because this wasn't just a business trip anymore. This was a battlefield, and Karen Whitmore had just made one very, very big mistake. She had underestimated Ava Sinclair. And tomorrow? That was going to cost her everything. The streets of Chicago at midnight carried a different kind of energy. An eerie calm that pulsed beneath the bright city lights, where the usual chaos of the day had settled into something quieter, something that felt almost watchful, as if the towering buildings themselves were leaning in to eavesdrop on the secrets being whispered through the streets. Ava Sinclair sat in the back of the rideshare, her hands curled into fists against the leather seat, her heart beating in calculated restraint, keeping pace with the rhythm of her thoughts, which were moving too fast, too sharp, too dangerous. Belmont Coffee House was only 10 minutes away now, a quiet, hole-in-the-wall cafe on the north side that wasn't the kind of place high-powered executives or corporate snakes like Karen Whitmore would frequent. It was the kind of place you went to disappear, to have conversations that weren't meant to be overheard, to trade information that wasn't meant to exist. The email from Gabriel Torres was still fresh in her mind, the warning looping in an endless cycle that made her pulse thrum with something between anticipation and dread. Karen doesn't just destroy careers, she buries people. She knew corporate politics were ruthless, knew that power wasn't just earned in places like Lockwood, it was taken, stolen, guarded like a kingdom built on blood and paper. But this wasn't about influence or boardroom maneuvering. This was about survival. And if Elijah Carter was right, if Lockwood wasn't just restructuring but burying something deeper, then Ava wasn't just an outsider poking at the edges of their empire anymore. She was a threat, the kind that needed to be silenced. The car slowed. She looked up, catching sight of the dimly lit neon sign hanging over the cafe entrance, flickering faintly against the glow of the city beyond. Belmont Coffee House. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging against the cold glass of the car window. She was here. This was it. Whatever truth Gabriel had to share, whatever information was waiting for her inside, it was the kind of thing that had made him risk reaching out, despite whatever leverage Karen still had over him. And that meant it was worth knowing. She stepped out of the car, her boots hitting the pavement with a quiet but deliberate sound, her spine straightening as she pushed past the lingering uncertainty in her gut. The cafe was nearly empty. Just a few scattered patrons, most of them hunched over their laptops. The soft hum of low conversation, mixing with the distant hiss of the espresso machine. The air smelled like burnt coffee and something stale, like a place that had existed in the cracks of the city for decades, forgotten by the world except for the people who needed a place to hide. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, instinct taking over, assessing, mapping out the space the way she always did in unfamiliar territory. Exit near the bathrooms. Kitchen door in the back. 2 security cameras, but old models, not connected to any major security network. And then she saw him. Gabriel Torres. Sitting in the farthest booth, his hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic coffee cup, his eyes flickering toward her the moment she walked in. Not with relief, but with the kind of tension that told her he wasn't sure if this meeting was a mistake. Ava hesitated only for a fraction of a second before closing the distance between them, sliding into the booth across from him in one smooth motion, her body language carefully controlled, making it clear that she wasn't afraid, but also that she wasn't here to waste time. "You came," Gabriel said quietly, his voice lower than she remembered from the plane, like the words themselves carried weight. Ava met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You sent the message," she said, voice even. "So tell me, what does Karen Whitmore have to bury?" Gabriel flinched slightly at her directness, glancing around before leaning in, lowering his voice further. "You don't understand what you've walked into." His fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles white against the ceramic. "This isn't about a business deal. This isn't about your contract. It's about Lockwood, the whole damn company. They're running a cover-up, something so big that even the board doesn't know the full extent of it. And Karen? She's not just a part of it. She's the one making sure no one ever finds out." Ava's pulse spiked, but her face remained neutral, carefully schooling her expression into something detached, something unreadable. "You're talking in riddles," she said, her voice edged with calm precision. "Give me something real." Gabriel exhaled sharply, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. "This is real." Ava didn't hesitate. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the contents, and then her breath caught. It was a payroll document, but not just any payroll document. It listed employees from Lockwood International, but not in Chicago. Overseas, workers under shell companies. The same names appearing under different subsidiaries, different accounts, different locations. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Some of the names were crossed out, terminated. Ava's stomach twisted. They weren't employees, they were assets. People being moved, hidden, silenced. Her pulse pounded as she looked up at Gabriel. "This isn't just corporate fraud," she whispered. "This is human trafficking." Gabriel nodded, his face pale. "And Karen is making sure it never sees the light of day." Ava's blood turned to ice. She had been ready for corporate corruption. She had been ready for fraud, for money laundering, for executive scandals. But this was bigger. This was the kind of crime that didn't just end careers, it ended lives. She set the paper down carefully, her hands steady despite the fire now burning in her chest. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, voice quiet but sharp, cutting through the false safety of the coffee shop walls. "Why now?" Gabriel exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Because I've been covering for them for years," he admitted, voice heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "I thought if I just kept my head down, if I didn't ask questions, I'd be safe. But I'm not. No one is. And now, I need a way out." His eyes locked onto hers. "And I think you might be the only way to get it." Ava studied him, weighing his words, her mind already calculating, strategizing, connecting the dots in ways that terrified her even more than Karen's threats. She wasn't just fighting for a contract anymore. She wasn't just dealing with corporate sabotage. She was sitting in the middle of a criminal empire, and Karen Whitmore was its enforcer. And now? Now Ava Sinclair was in the crosshairs. She folded the document, slipping it into her jacket. "I need more," she said, her voice steady, her decision already made. "Names, financial records, every trace of this that exists." Gabriel nodded. "I can get it," he said. "But after that, you're on your own." Ava exhaled slowly, her pulse thrumming with something that felt dangerously close to resolve. "No," she said quietly, her gaze turning sharp as steel. "I'm just getting started." Ava Sinclair had spent her entire career learning how to navigate high-stakes negotiations, diffuse corporate power plays, and stay two steps ahead of those who sought to silence, control, or outmaneuver her. But nothing, not even the cutthroat world of corporate consulting, had ever prepared her for what she was now walking into. This wasn't business anymore. This was a battlefield. As she stepped out of Belmont Coffee House and into the crisp Chicago night, the city seemed different, sharper, more dangerous, as if she could feel the weight of the information she now carried pressing against her ribs, coiling in her lungs like something alive. The document Gabriel had given her, the list of hidden employees, falsified payrolls, and strategically terminated names, wasn't just evidence of corporate fraud. It was something far worse. A human trafficking operation. And Karen Whitmore? She wasn't just Lockwood's enforcer. She was its gatekeeper. The woman who had spent years ensuring that no one, no journalist, no whistleblower, no executive with a guilty conscience, ever uncovered the truth. And now Ava knew that the moment Gabriel had slid that document across the table, the moment she had read those names, she had become a problem Karen needed to eliminate. She wasn't just fighting for a contract anymore. She wasn't just trying to salvage her career. She was trying to stay alive. She kept her steps measured, her breath steady as she moved toward the corner of the street, pulling out her phone as if she were just another business traveler calling for a car, when in reality she was already running calculated escape routes in her head, assessing every movement in her periphery, every shadow that seemed to linger too long, every car idling where it shouldn't be. She had always been hyper-aware of her surroundings, a habit drilled into her from years of walking into boardrooms where she was the only woman, the only black executive, the only person who had to constantly assess whether she was walking into an opportunity or a trap. But now, the stakes weren't just professional. They were life and death. She glanced down at her phone. A new text from Elijah Carter. We need to talk. Urgent. She exhaled sharply. If Elijah, a journalist who had clearly been chasing this story long before she had even stepped onto that plane, thought this was urgent, then she needed to move. Fast. A car pulled up. Not the rideshare she had requested, but a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, too polished, too deliberate, and every instinct in her body screamed danger. Ava took a step back, pretending to scroll through her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs as the passenger side window rolled down slowly. And then a voice. Smooth, confident, dangerous. Miss Sinclair? The man in the driver's seat said, his smile a fraction too sharp, his suit too perfectly tailored, like someone who wasn't here to negotiate, but to deliver a message. Get in. We need to have a conversation. She recognized his type instantly. Not a Lockwood executive, not one of the polished, power-hungry corporate figures she was used to dealing with. This was a fixer, a cleaner. Someone who operated in the spaces between legality and silence. He wasn't here to intimidate her. He was here to make her disappear. Ava's mind raced. She could run, but they were already watching her. She could call for help, but she didn't know who she could trust. Instead, she did the only thing that made sense in a moment like this. She smiled, controlled, measured, as if she wasn't rattled at all, as if she were still in complete control. I'd love to chat, she said, tilting her head slightly. But I have another meeting to get to. The man smiled didn't falter, but his eyes darkened slightly, the look of a predator who had just been told his prey wasn't going to go down easily. We insist, he said smoothly, and the way he said we sent another sharp pulse of adrenaline through her. He wasn't alone. Karen had sent them. Ava inhaled slowly, calculating. She had maybe 3 seconds to act before they escalated. 3 seconds before she went from a corporate consultant who had seen too much to just another name on that list of terminated employees. So she did the last thing they expected. She dropped her phone onto the pavement. A small, seemingly careless movement, but it sent her belongings scattering, her phone, her keys, her wallet, forcing the driver to glance down for just a fraction of a second. And in that moment, she moved. Fast. She pivoted, stepped back, and into the path of an oncoming taxi. One she had spotted a few moments earlier, its driver waiting for a fare just a few feet away. The driver slammed the brakes, cursing, but it was the perfect distraction. Ava didn't wait. She threw open the back door and dove inside. Drive, she said, voice sharp, controlled as she slammed the door shut. Now. The driver hesitated for only a fraction of a second before deciding that whatever had just happened was above his pay grade. Because in the rearview mirror he saw the black SUV hesitate for too long, saw the man in the driver's seat watching her with something cold and unreadable before speeding off into the night. Only when the SUV was gone did Ava exhale. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her expression calm, collected, forcing down the rising panic clawing at her chest. She had expected resistance. She had expected sabotage, but she hadn't expected them to try and grab her off the street. This was escalation. This was Lockwood sending a message. And now, Ava had a message of her own. She pulled out her phone, the spare she kept in the lining of her bag, because she wasn't stupid enough to carry just one, and dialed Elijah Carter. He answered on the first ring. Ava? They just tried to take me, she said, her voice steady, sharp, cutting through the fear trying to settle in her bones. Whatever this is, Elijah, it's bigger than we thought. A pause. Then his voice dropped lower. Where are you? Heading toward the South Loop, she said. We need to meet. Now. There was another pause, then Elijah exhaled sharply. I have a safe house, he said. texting you the address. Ava nodded, gripping the phone tighter as she felt the full weight of the moment settle in her chest. She had tried to play this the right way, the corporate way. She had followed the rules, but the rules didn't apply anymore. This wasn't business. This was war. And Karen Whitmore? She had just made the mistake of coming for the wrong woman. Ava Sinclair had always been a strategist, a woman who understood that the game of power wasn't won by brute force, but by precision, by knowing when to strike and when to hold back, when to listen and when to speak, when to let the enemy think they had you cornered, only so you could trap them in their own deception. But tonight, as she slipped through the dim-lit corridors of a South Loop safe house, adrenaline still thrumming in her veins, she realized that this wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't about contracts or corporate sabotage or even career survival. This was about staying alive. Elijah Carter had been waiting when she arrived, standing near a dusty wooden table, a dim overhead light throwing sharp shadows across his face. His usual easy charm replaced by something sharper, something darker, something that told her he knew exactly what she had just escaped. His apartment, if you could call it that, was the definition of transient, the kind of place used by people who never stayed in one spot too long. A mattress on the floor, an old couch pushed against the wall, maps, notes, and documents pinned in a chaotic pattern across one side of the room. The kind of investigative madness that only made sense to the man who had put it together. A journalist's war room. Ava barely had time to take it in before he grabbed her wrist, eyes scanning her for injuries. "Did they hurt you?" His voice was low, urgent, and for a moment, the warmth in it almost broke through the steel casing she had wrapped around herself. But she couldn't afford to break. Not now. "No," she said, shaking her head. Though the phantom touch of the SUV's looming presence, the way the driver had looked at her like she was already buried, still clung to her skin like frost. But they tried. The words felt heavier when she said them out loud, like admitting them made the night even more real. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her breathing. "They sent someone. A fixer. Smooth, professional. The kind that doesn't leave loose ends." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Karen?" Ava nodded. "Who else?" A grim silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken conclusions. Then Elijah turned, moving toward the chaotic collage of notes on his wall, his fingers tracing over the names, the timelines, the photographs pinned there with red strings, connecting points of interest like a detective unraveling a conspiracy no one else was supposed to see. And maybe that was exactly what this was. A conspiracy. A machine built so perfectly, so ruthlessly, that anyone who stepped too close vanished before they could ask the wrong questions. Ava ran a hand through her hair, trying to push the events of the night into something orderly, logical, something she could analyze instead of fear. "They're covering something up," she said, her voice firmer now, pushing past the lingering tremor in her chest. "Lockwood isn't just involved in financial fraud. This is bigger. People are disappearing." Elijah turned to her, his expression unreadable, and then, after a long pause, he walked to a locked metal case sitting beside his makeshift desk, pulling out a thick folder, the kind that looked like it had been collected piece by piece, story by story, at great personal risk. He handed it to her without a word. Ava opened it, flipping through the pages as a slow, horrifying clarity settled in. Names, dates, photographs. People who had worked for Lockwood subsidiaries, shuffled between companies, entire employment records vanishing without a trace. Some of them had been whistleblowers, mid-level executives who had quietly resigned before they could say too much. Others were contractors, people whose involvement was never supposed to be documented. And then there were the ones with no records at all. She stopped at a page near the end, her stomach tightening like a vice. It was a news article from 2 years ago. Financial consultant and whistleblower found dead in apparent suicide. The man in the photo was Gabriel Torres. Except it wasn't. Ava's pulse stilled, then spiked. She looked up at Elijah. "This isn't right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gabriel is alive. I just met with him." Elijah exhaled sharply. "I know." The room tilted, reality twisting into something surreal. Ava closed the folder, fingers pressing hard against the cover, as if holding it shut could stop the horrible, inescapable conclusion forming in her mind. Lockwood had faked deaths before. It wasn't just a financial cover-up. It wasn't just trafficking. It was erasure. "They're burying people," she said, barely recognizing her own voice. "Not just covering their tracks, they're erasing anyone who gets too close." Elijah nodded, running a hand through his short-cropped hair, his own exhaustion evident. "Gabriel got out before they could finish the job," he said. "But Lockwood doesn't leave loose ends if Karen knows he's still alive. She'll come for him." Ava finished the sentence, the certainty settling into her bones like ice. She inhaled sharply, every survival instinct screaming at her to leave, to pack up, disappear, go somewhere Lockwood's reach didn't extend. But that wasn't who she was. She had spent her whole career fighting to be in rooms people said she didn't belong in, tearing down obstacles built to keep people like her out. And she wasn't about to start running now. She looked at Elijah, her resolve solidifying. "We need to get to him before they do." Elijah hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then he nodded. "I might know where he is," he said, already reaching for his laptop. Ava rolled her shoulders, shaking off the remnants of fear, replacing it with something sharper. Lockwood thought they could silence people. They thought they could bury the truth. But they had just made the biggest mistake of all. They had underestimated her. Ava Sinclair had always understood that power wasn't about who had the biggest name or the highest title. It was about who controlled the flow of information, about who knew what and when they knew it, about who could act first and who was left scrambling in the aftermath. And right now, as she and Elijah Carter drove through the quiet, rain-slicked streets of Chicago toward an address that might or might not lead them to Gabriel Torres, she realized just how dangerous it was to be the person who suddenly knew too much. The weight of the information in her possession, the truth about Lockwood's hidden operations, the fabricated deaths, the buried employees, the people who had been erased before they could expose what was really happening, sat heavy in her chest, a leaden coil of urgency and dread twisting together into something sharp, something that left no room for hesitation. Karen Whitmore wouldn't sit idly by. If she had already sent someone after Ava in the middle of the city, in the open with the risk of witnesses, then that meant Karen wasn't just cleaning up loose ends anymore. She was rushing to contain something bigger, something that was spiraling out of her control. And that single realization sent Ava's mind into overdrive because if Karen was rushing, if she was acting without her usual methodical precision, then that meant there was still a window of opportunity. Small, razor thin, but there. If Ava could get to Gabriel first, if she could pull him completely out of whatever shadows he'd been hiding in, if she could get proof, real, undeniable proof, then Lockwood couldn't just make this disappear. The thought sent another pulse of adrenaline through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm, focused, her fingers drumming lightly against the dashboard as Elijah drove. His jaw tight, his eyes flicking between the GPS on his phone and the darkened side streets they passed, his tension as sharp as hers. "This place," he finally said, voice low, controlled, as if speaking too loudly might somehow call attention to them. "It's not exactly a safe house, but it's close. It's an old loft, one of those places off the grid. Gabriel's been using it for a while now, paying in cash, keeping his head down." He hesitated, then added, "But if I found him, that means someone else might have too." The unspoken warning hung heavy in the air, but Ava only nodded because she already knew that. She had felt it in her bones the moment she'd gotten into Elijah's car, that deep, instinctive certainty that they weren't moving fast enough, that someone else was already ahead of them, that the game was shifting in ways neither of them had fully calculated yet. Still, she had to try. They turned onto a narrow street, quiet and empty in a way that felt unnatural for Chicago, lined with old warehouses and converted lofts, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, where no one asked questions about who came and went at odd hours, where someone could vanish for months without raising a single alarm. Elijah pulled the car to a slow stop outside a nondescript brick building, its windows dark, its metal door unmarked. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ava could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the faint patter of rain against the windshield, the distant hum of the city beyond, all of it pressing in like an invisible weight. Then, without a word, she unbuckled her seatbelt, reaching into her bag and wrapping her fingers around the cold, familiar weight of her pepper spray. Not much against a gun, but better than nothing. Elijah exhaled through his nose, then did the same, tucking a small folding knife into his pocket before reaching for the door handle. "Stay close," he murmured, and Ava gave him a look that made it clear she didn't need reminding. She wasn't new to this. The moment they stepped out of the car, the air felt different, charged, expectant, like a wire stretched too tight, seconds from snapping. They moved quickly, stepping over cracked pavement, the glow of a flickering street lamp casting long shadows as they approached the metal door. Elijah knocked once, 3 short raps, a pattern, probably a signal, but there was no answer. Ava felt the first prickle of unease creep up her spine. Another knock, another stretch of silence, and then the faintest sound from inside. A rustle, a shift, something barely audible, but there. Someone was in there. Elijah shot her a look, then reached into his pocket, producing a key, and that alone told Ava more than she needed to know. If Elijah had a way inside, if he had been keeping tabs on Gabriel long before now, then that meant he had been expecting something like this. He slid the key into the lock, turned it slowly, and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. Ava followed. The loft was dark, cold. The scent of stale coffee and dust thick in the air, and as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she took in the space. Minimal furniture, scattered papers, a laptop still open on the counter, the faint outline of a cot against the far wall. And then she saw him. Gabriel. Slumped in a chair, his face bruised, his left eye swollen shut, blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. Ava's breath caught, and standing behind him, half in shadow, gun in hand, the barrel pressed lightly against Gabriel's temple. Karen Whitmore. The world seemed to slow, everything snapping into sharp, unbearable clarity. As Karen's lips curled into a small, almost amused smile, her perfectly manicured nails glinting under the dim light as she shifted her grip on the gun. Her posture so effortlessly composed that she might as well have been standing at a boardroom podium instead of holding a man's life in her hands. "Ava Sinclair," she said, voice smooth as glass, as if they were merely 2 colleagues meeting by chance, instead of 2 opponents who had been circling each other from the moment Ava had stepped onto that plane. "I was wondering when you'd catch up." Ava didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't let herself show even a flicker of hesitation. Because hesitation, right now, meant death. She forced her expression into calm, neutral indifference, tilting her head slightly as if Karen wasn't currently holding a gun to Gabriel's head, as if this was just another high-stakes negotiation, another game of corporate chess where she just needed to make the right move before the board collapsed beneath her. "I have to say," Ava murmured, her voice even calculated, "this is a bit dramatic, even for you." Karen's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, come now," she said, her tone edged with something like mock disappointment. "You didn't really think you were going to win, did you?" Ava's fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she didn't let the anger show. That's what Karen wanted. She wanted her off balance, emotional, easy to control. But Ava had played this game before. And this time, she wasn't going to lose. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet, deliberate, measured like a blade. Karen arched a brow, gun still steady. Oh? Ava smiled, sharp as steel. I don't think I'm going to win. Then she took one slow step forward, meeting Karen's eyes with the full force of her unwavering certainty. I know I already have. For a single, razor-thin moment, the loft held its breath as if the very walls, the air itself, were bracing for the inevitable explosion. The shift from tension to violence, from words to action, from a silent standoff to something irreversible. Ava Sinclair locked eyes with Karen Whitmore, refusing to blink, refusing to look at the gun, refusing to acknowledge the immediate chilling reality that a single squeeze of that trigger would end Gabriel Torres right in front of her. And yet she smiled, a sharp, calculated expression that was neither careless nor naive, but the kind of smile that belonged to someone who knew they had already flipped the board before the other player even realized the game had changed. Karen had always operated with certainty, with arrogance, with the belief that she was untouchable, the architect of every outcome, the master manipulator who bent reality to her will. But that was precisely why Ava was still standing, while so many others had already fallen. Because Karen, for all her ruthlessness, still believed that she controlled the pieces on the board. But Ava? Ava had been playing an entirely different game. You don't have the control you think you do, Ava said, voice measured, deliberate, designed to unnerve, to make Karen doubt, to crack the certainty that was her greatest weapon. You think you can kill him? Right here? Right now? And what, you'll just walk away? She took a slow step forward, her movements too casual, her hands at her sides, her expression one of calm detachment, as if she were observing a predictable inconvenience rather than standing in front of a loaded gun. I'm not stupid, Karen. I know you don't do your own dirty work. She tilted her head, the small gesture enough to make Karen's grip on the gun shift ever so slightly, an unconscious reaction to being thrown off balance. That's what you have enforcers for. That's what you have fixers for. You keep your hands clean. Another step. And now you're here, personally, risking yourself. Standing in this room instead of sending someone else? She let the silence stretch, let Karen feel it, let her realize just how exposed she actually was. For the first time, Karen didn't immediately respond. A flicker of something, not fear, not yet, but doubt, passed through her perfectly composed mask. Ava pressed forward, verbal scalpel in hand. This isn't just about shutting him up, is it? She gestured subtly toward Gabriel, still slumped in the chair, his breathing ragged but steady, blood drying at the corner of his mouth. You're desperate. The word landed like a gunshot, not in volume but in impact. Karen's fingers tightened around the gun, but her lips pursed, the smallest of tells. She was listening now. Ava took another step, and another, until she was close enough to see the precise shade of Karen's expensive lipstick, close enough to feel the heat of her anger, close enough that the gun was no longer just aimed at Gabriel, but at both of them. I already won, Karen, Ava said again, quieter this time, dangerously quiet, her voice slipping between them like smoke. Because you're not holding me here. You're not cornering me. I came here. I walked into this room, knowing you'd be here, and I still came. She let the words sink in, let them register, watched as Karen's mind raced through every possible meaning, every possible implication, every hidden move she might have missed. And do you know what that means? Karen's lips parted, a question half formed, but Ava cut her off before she could speak. It means I was ready for you, Ava said. It means you walked into a trap. Karen didn't flinch, not physically, but Ava saw the way her pupils dilated slightly, saw the way her weight shifted ever so subtly, saw the moment she realized she might not be the one holding all the cards after all. Ava let the silence linger, then slowly, deliberately, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and turned the screen toward Karen. The screen was open to a live video feed, a feed showing the outside of the loft, and in that video feed, Karen could see them. The men in suits, the vehicles blocking the exits, the way the shadows moved with intent, surrounding the building like a net closing in. Ava saw the exact moment it hit Karen, the realization that she had walked into something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. "I don't work alone either," Ava murmured. Karen's jaw tightened. The gun didn't lower, but her stance shifted. Not an offensive posture now, but a defensive one. Calculating, reevaluating. "Federal agents," Ava continued. "Calm, cold, controlled. And journalists and cameras. You made the mistake of trying to erase someone who already had a backup plan. And then you made the mistake of coming here yourself. And now," she tilted her head, "now I wonder how many of your bosses are watching this right now, realizing that you've become a liability." That landed. Karen's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Ava to see. Because Karen knew. She knew that men like Lockwood's executives, like the real puppeteers of this operation, the ones who sat behind glass desks and never got their hands dirty, they didn't tolerate exposure. They didn't tolerate loose ends. And right now, Karen Whitmore was the biggest loose end in the entire equation. A beat of silence, and then Karen exhaled, slow, controlled, and, to Ava's utter lack of surprise, she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a kind smile. A smile of acknowledgement, of reluctant admiration. "You really are impressive," Karen said, almost fondly, as if Ava were a particularly clever chess opponent rather than the woman who had just orchestrated her downfall. "I know," Ava said simply. And then Karen lowered the gun. Slowly, deliberately, and Ava? Ava simply waited, watching, knowing that Karen was already planning, already thinking of how to pivot, how to survive this, how to slip through the cracks once more. But this time, there were no cracks left. Outside, the first flash of red and blue lights illuminated the rain-slicked streets, sirens splitting the night. And Karen Whitmore, powerful, untouchable, ruthless Karen Whitmore, closed her eyes for the briefest second. She knew it too. The game was over. And this time, she had lost. The handcuffs clicked shut around Karen Whitmore's wrist with a finality that even she couldn't ignore. Though if Ava Sinclair had learned anything about her over the past few months, it was that Karen wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly. Even now, standing in the middle of the rain-slicked street, the glow of police lights flashing in rhythmic bursts across her sharp, still impeccable features, she held her head high, her posture unbroken, her expression unreadable. But Ava saw it, the crack in her composure, the way her fingers curled just slightly against the metal cuffs, as if testing their restraint, as if her mind was already racing for another way out. And maybe, once upon a time, she would have found one. Maybe there had been a version of this night where Karen slipped away, where her network of power and influence reached out in unseen hands and swept her from danger, leaving nothing behind but an unsolved case and a story no one would believe. But that version of events had died the moment Ava had stepped off that plane, the moment she had refused to be moved, the moment she had recognized Karen not just as an obstacle but as a challenge, as a problem that could be solved with the right precision, the right leverage, the right strategy. And Ava had played the long game. She had planned for every move, accounted for every contingency, built her case not just in whispers and speculation, but in irrefutable evidence, in testimony and documentation, and legal firepower that no amount of bribery or coercion could erase. The press was already waiting. Journalists leaning forward with microphones, cameras flashing, voices rising in a chaotic symphony of questions, the kind that Karen had spent her career avoiding, deflecting, silencing before they ever reached public ears. But now she was the story. Elijah Carter stood just behind Ava, his phone still in hand, the recording still rolling, capturing every moment of Karen's downfall. And as the officer secured her in the back of the squad car, he leaned in slightly, his voice just loud enough for Ava to hear over the storm of voices and sirens. "You did it," he murmured, and though his tone was steady, she could hear the thread of something deeper underneath. Relief, admiration, maybe even a little awe. But Ava didn't answer right away. Not yet. Instead, she turned, catching Karen's gaze through the open squad car door, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the final move of a battle neither had been willing to lose. Karen's lips curled, not quite a smile, but something close, something dark and knowing and unrepentant. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't anger in her voice nor desperation. It was something that almost sounded like respect. "You're good," Karen said softly, like a secret only they were meant to hear, like a mentor acknowledging a student who had finally surpassed them. "Better than I gave you credit for." Ava tilted her head slightly, watching Karen as if studying a puzzle she had already solved, but found interesting nonetheless. "I know." A beat of silence. Then the officer closed the door, sealing Karen Whitmore inside. And just like that, it was over. Or at least this part was. Because even as the squad cars pulled away, even as the cameras followed their departure, even as reporters scrambled for sound bites and reactions, Ava knew this wasn't the end. Lockwood was still out there. The people behind Karen, the ones who had let her take the fall to protect their own secrets, the ones who would be looking for the next move, the next play, the next way to bury what they had built before the full weight of exposure came crashing down on them. And Ava? She wasn't done yet. The thought should have been overwhelming, should have made her exhausted, but instead, as she let out a slow breath, as the tension of the past weeks began to unravel from her shoulders, she felt something else entirely. Satisfaction. Because this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Elijah stepped closer, sliding his phone into his pocket, his presence steady beside her. "So," he said, studying her carefully, like he was trying to gauge whether or not she was already moving to the next battle. "What now?" Ava smiled, slow and deliberate, feeling, for the first time in a long time, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Now?" she repeated, glancing back toward the city, toward the skyscrapers glowing against the night like a battlefield, waiting for its next war. "Now we go after the rest of them." And she meant it. Because if Lockwood thought this was over, if they thought losing Karen meant they had cut off the threat at its root, if they thought they could still hide, still operate in the shadows, still bury the past beneath layers of corporate silence, they were wrong. Ava Sinclair had just rewritten the rules, and she wasn't stopping now. The lesson in Ava Sinclair's story is one of resilience, strategy, and the power of refusing to be silenced. At its core, this is a story about how one seemingly small act of defiance, refusing to give up her rightful seat on a plane, uncovered a much larger system of injustice, corruption, and abuse of power. It shows that those in control often rely on intimidation, manipulation, and the assumption that people will back down. But true power lies in perseverance, intelligence, and knowing when to make the right move. Ava didn't win because she was louder or more aggressive. She won because she played the long game, gathered the right allies, and understood that justice isn't just about fighting back. It's about fighting smart. The story also highlights how systems of corruption protect those at the top until someone dares to disrupt them with undeniable truth. Karen Whitmore, once untouchable, became a casualty of the very system she thought she controlled. A reminder that even the most powerful are vulnerable when the right person is willing to expose their secrets. In the end, Ava's journey teaches that justice is not given, it is taken, and sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to move.